So moving from the admissions assessment, the admissions test, did you do any preparation for your interview?
I did. So the Cambridge interview and the Oxford interview are unique pretty much in that they're very traditional. So it's like a job interview almost where, well, though even those are changing now. But yeah, so you'll
Mm.
have usually a couple of interviewers and it will just be you on your own. And they'll speak to you for 20 to 25 minutes. And they could ask you basically anything, but it's usually related to what you've been studying at school. So the preparation I did for that was very much quite, actually, it was quite crammed in because it was amongst all of the other non-Cambridge interviews that I had, and they were different. But I had about a week to prepare for Cambridge between some other interviews that I had. So I just revised loads of GCSE science content. Basically, I crammed biology and a little bit of chemistry and some maths. And I might have looked at some physics formulas because someone told me they could ask me physics, but I wasn't doing physics A level. But thankfully, they didn't ask me any physics, but it was a lot of biology. So I found a really good free website. It's called Seneca, and it basically runs like practice questions in, or it almost covers the whole like GCSE syllabus. So I would select like AQA GCSE biology and then just run through their course really quickly. And it was quite interactive. So it made it a bit more fun than just looking back at my flashcards that I kind of wanted to forget about after
Yeah.
doing my exams. So that was a good resource. Yeah, I think for Cambridge especially, it's just a case of learning your scientific facts and trusting yourself as well. I think a lot of the Cambridge interview and Oxford interviews, it's a bit of a mental test as well in terms of your trusting in yourself and not, keeping your cool in the interview.
Mm.
A lot of people get very stressed and struggle and they get flustered and they don't know what to say. And you'll hear from me now and also from loads of people on the internet that you have to think out loud. That's the thing everyone says.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, you need to be able to form coherent sentences and get your thoughts straight and think slowly. And practicing that, I think, is really useful before your interview. So trusting that you know your stuff and that you know your GCSE content and that it is in the back of your mind. So when they ask you that question, you can somehow work your way back to that knowledge that you've got and take it back to basics. And if you're completely off, then hopefully the interviewers will help you. They usually do. They certainly did for me. And I think knowing that and building that mental resilience before going into the interview is also a really valuable thing to do. And then my other medicine interviews were completely different. And it was like almost hot seating, rotating around a room. They ask you things like, why do you want to be a medical student? And it's so different. So just also being able to switch out of that mindset and knowing that your Oxbridge interview is not going to be like that is a useful thing to realize as well.
Oh, so those later interviews were interviews from other universities?
Yeah, so I think I had a couple, maybe one or two before my Cambridge interview. I think Exeter and Nottingham were quite early on, and then my Imperial interview was in January, I think, and they were all three of those were very similar in style. So the Cambridge one was very unique and different, and so being able to switch off from preparing for the other three and just focusing on the Cambridge interview for a week was a really useful thing to try and do, I think.
And do you remember like what your Cambridge interviews were like? Like what
Yeah, so I had at this college, I'm at Trinity Hall. I had two interviews, both in person, although I think a lot of them are online now, but the format's basically the same. So my first interview was at like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was about 25 to 30 minutes long, and it was with two fellows, medical fellows at the college, who happened to eventually become my supervisors. And the first, they kind of took it in turns to ask questions. So one of them spoke to me for 10 minutes, while the other one wrote notes, and then they swapped. And they started off with a really general question, and I think that's quite common from hearing what other students had asked as well. So they asked me, like, tell me about this topic. So they said, tell me about tissues. And I felt at the time, I questioned in my head, I was like, oh, I could make a joke here about like tissue paper. And I was like, no, don't do that. Like, don't make a joke. Don't do it. Resist the temptation. He means like cells, stick to cells, like stick to biology. So I did. I'm very grateful I did. So I talked about like tissues are made of cells. Like I went literally what I was saying earlier, go back to the basic facts.
Yeah.
And we're taught, what do we know about tissues? Tissues are made of cells. And then I said, what are cells made of? Well, cells are made of like organelles, and organelles are made of like lipids, proteins, and carbohydrates. And then they said, okay, well, could you draw me a phospholipid membrane? So I had a whiteboard and they made me draw a phospholipid membrane. And then he asked me, we kind of I felt like it was both me directing. I kind of would say things, and then in response, the interviewer would ask what they wanted to ask, but it was always a mixture of me and him kind of leading. So that was quite cool. And that reassured me that they wanted to see where I was going and what I was thinking. And once I kind of figured out that was what they were trying to do and just suss out how I was thinking, I felt a bit more relaxed. And I was like, they're actually just trying to see how my brain works. They're not trying to catch me out. They're just curious. So I'm going to trust that what I'm saying is what I want them to hear. And that was the first sort of few minutes. And then the second, we swapped to the other interviewer, and he presented me with this strange looking device, and it had like a glass column in it. And he was like, what do you think this is? It had a pump. So I said, well, it looks like a thermometer or like a meter of some kind, and there's a pump, so maybe it's to do with pressure. And he was like, oh yeah. And then he showed me a photo, like a really old print. There was like a painting of a horse, and it had this same column like sticking out of its neck. And we chatted about what that might be. And then I think I wasn't 100% convinced by my answer, but he said it's a like a blood pressure monitor for horses from a long time ago, and it had mercury in it, which is not, the mercury was in the column,
right? Okay,
but they wouldn't use that nowadays. We joked about that. I remember joking about mercury in it definitely being a good thing that it's not used anymore. So yeah, and I definitely remember getting something distinctly wrong. They asked me like, well, it was, I don't know, I think they asked me this to just see how I would respond. So they asked me what the density of mercury was, and I remember thinking, I have like, why would I know this? Because it wasn't anything I'd kind of just learned off the top of my head, and I didn't remember the density of mercury from chemistry A level.
Yeah.
So they made me guess, and I just took a random guess, and I wasn't too far off, but I remember thinking, because he really pushed me. He was like, just guess. And I was thinking,
already,
if I have to guess, I'm probably going to get this completely wrong. But I think they wanted me to be okay with guessing and be okay with getting it wrong. And I knew that, so I kind of didn't mind. But that was the first interview. And then I had about 2-hour break between that one and the second one, which I think is kind of common. And I remember there was a student, another medical applicant, who was in the other interview at the same time I was in mine, and then we swapped. So I went into the second interview, and they had my personal statement and a little picture of me on the table. They asked me, it was my director of studies actually was doing that interview. So my director of studies, and then another fellow, and it was in his office. The room was really nice, you know, there's sofas and a round table. And he just said, so I've got your personal statement here, and I can see you've mentioned you did an EPQ, which is like it's an extended project qualification, and it's a little sort of side project you can do at A-level.
What was your EPQ on?
The human cytomegalovirus, which is, it's actually really interesting. So, well, to me anyway, 60% of people have it, like just latent in their cells. But if you're immunocompromised, it can kill you. But it's so common, like so many people have it and don't realize because it doesn't cause any damage.
What was it again?
Human cytomegalovirus, HCMV. Yeah, because it's not that big a deal unless you're immunocompromised, and then it's a big deal.
Then it's a big deal.
Yeah, so I was worried if you're on immunosuppressants. So say you have cancer, it could be really serious. And I was thinking, well, more and more people are getting cancer. So my topic title was, to what extent is HCMV a threat to the future of the UK population? Yeah, well, they asked me, it was the first question in my second interview, and I think they started with it because they knew I was comfortable talking about it, which was nice. And I remember almost thinking, yes, they've asked me about something I know about. So they just asked me to tell them about it. And it was quite funny because I think I kind of fell upon the topic of my EPQ by looking at current Cambridge research. And then my interviewer was like, oh yeah, I know the 2 guys that are researching this right now. And then I was like, oh no, I'm not so happy they've asked me about this. But they actually didn't press me for anything too much. I think it was just a kind of icebreaker question. So we chatted about that. And then I kind of got onto the topic of immunocompromised patients and ethics of that. And that was I think it was just a kind of friendly conversation. So that was the first half of that interview. And then the second interviewer, I think she presented me with a graph. It's not uncommon they'll give you a graph or an equation or something like that in an interview. And it was an oxygen dissociation curve. So it's something from A-level biology. And we looked at how that adapts if you live in a mountain versus at sea level, and how different animals kind of change their physiology to match the oxygen saturation in the air. And I remember really struggling with some equations she gave me, and then I remembered it from school, and we chatted about that for a bit, and then we were out of time. And that interview seemed to go really quickly. It might have actually been a bit shorter than the first one, but yeah, it was very much focused on stuff I'd studied at school, and they didn't ask me anything I didn't think I was at least to some degree knowledgeable about. They might have pushed me. In fact, the last question they asked me in my first interview was really funny because after they asked me and I gave them some kind of rough idea of what I thought, they said, actually, no one knows the answer to this question, but we just thought we'd ask you and see what you thought. And I was like, oh, okay, all right.
That says a lot about interviews. It's not really about the answer.
Exactly.
Always.
They just want to see how you deal with them throwing all sorts of questions at you, and thinking out loud and not, losing your focus in a difficult, challenging environment. And that's I really enjoyed that because I kind of knew they were going to do that. Nice. And I was thinking, oh yeah, I'm ticking off that Cambridge interview experience. This is what I thought was going to happen. But I think a lot of people get really flustered and kind of panic. But if you go in knowing that is the kind of thing they're going to ask you, I think that really helps. And I kind of, when at the end they were like, yeah, no one really knows, I thought, oh, okay, I see what you're doing here. So it was quite enjoyable. I enjoyed it. And also the interviews are at Christmas time, and I was lucky that back then the interviews were in person, and it's just nice to be in Cambridge. But even if I hadn't been here, I think it's cool to it's the first glimpse of people. Most people have never really met anyone who's a fellow at a Cambridge college or a supervisor at Cambridge college. And you hear about these Cambridge interviews, and then, I think when you actually experience it, it's quite cool. So I was like, yeah, this is fun, even if it was actually quite scary. And I knew I was like, oh, this is quite important here. But I would say try not to think about it that way, and then you can enjoy it a bit more.
Yeah, I definitely think people should, applicants should be encouraged to ask questions to the interviewer if they're confused of what they've said. They shouldn't, if they don't understand the question, they shouldn't just sit there and not say anything.
I think a good way to overcome that hesitancy or thinking, just saying, I don't know, a really good way I think to address that or overcome that is to say, I'm not entirely sure what this might be, but I know this could be related to this, and this thing is something you've studied. So, for example, if they asked me about the horse with the jugular vein and the pressure, I might say, well, I don't actually know what the device is, but I can see it's in the horse's neck, and I know that there's a big blood vessel that runs through the neck, and you can see it pulsing. So maybe they're looking at that, and then they would go, or no, and tell you. Exactly. So I think just this is the whole thinking out loud thing. And it's okay to say, I don't know, but you have to follow it up with something you do know.
Yeah, you can't, because if you say I don't know and then not say anything, you're kind of giving up. They want to see you keep trying.
They want to see you persevere.
That's yeah, exactly. Did you ever explain the mercury question, how expected you to know the answer, out of curiosity?
I think they kind of explained what was in. It was really odd. It was like a really old drawing from the 1700s, and so it was actually quite hard to see what was going on in the drawing. So once that kind of stopped me from figuring it out easily, and then once I asked, I was kind of like, well, I'm not actually sure what I can see in the drawing. And he said, well, this is a glass column, and can you see something in the column? And then I was like, oh, actually, yeah, I can see there's a kind of pressure line and a fluid line. Maybe they're reading the blood pressure.
Because I guess if it's liquids, then it tends to might be similar to water. Could be. Then that would have been a decent,
Yeah.